Up first, it's an honor to introduce an incredible group. They're going to be talking about startup inception during volatile times to stories of thriving scale-up companies. The leaders in this discussion are going to share invaluable insights into the challenges and opportunities that accompany the ambitious task of scaling a company. From growth strategies to strategic marketing and sales strategies to the art and science of securing crucial investments. In conversation with Chief Delivery Officer at Mars Discovery District, Krista Jones, please welcome co-founder of Dealmaker, Rebecca Kacaba, and CEO of Lightspeed, JP Chauvet.
Hello, everybody. Now it's the lights, I can't really see your faces, so you're gonna have to make noise so that we can see your reactions. There we go. That will help us enormously to be able to see how the talk's going. So happy to be here, especially with these two, because I think we're in for a good conversation this afternoon. I want to start with kind of a little bit of a softball question, but it's in an introduction, Juanita talked about the art or science of scaling a company. All I know is it's really hard work, but underneath that, I'll just ask both of you, where do you land on the side of art or the side of science as you both looked at scaling your companies?
Well, that's an easy one for me because the quote I have on the wall of my home office is Andy Warhol, where he says, "Good business is the best art."
So I'm in between. So hello, everyone. I think it's both. I think you start with art, and you need to be creative, you need a good idea, you need to know how to, what are you doing to a market and what is your purpose. But then I think for it to scale, it becomes science, and it becomes data-driven, and it's about data, and it's about trial and error, basically.
When I think about both of your journeys in terms of, and I did a little bit of sleuthing in the background of the journeys that you've both been on, each of you kind of have reached scale in different pathways in terms of getting to where you're at. So let's start off by talking a little bit about kind of the first, getting your first kind of sizable, the 10 million in revenue for Lightspeed. When you reached that, Lightspeed was the revenue was break even. That's a fairly sizable accomplishment in the world of scaling. So could you maybe talk a little bit about some of the financial strategies and some of the business strategies you use that help you to get there in a profitable or break even manner?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So Lightspeed today, just as we're publicly traded in New York and Toronto. We have 3,000 employees. We're about $1 billion now in revenues. So it was and all of this in about 11 years. But I think what's very unique to our story is normally when you start a business, the first thing you do is you look for money so that you can fuel the first steps of your growth, you can fuel product development. We took a bootstrap approach. So for the first $10 million, this was a purely organic business, and if we didn't get the dollars, well, we didn't do the investments. And for us, what we did is we relied on partnerships, and our first partner was Apple. And you remember the Apple stores 10, 11 years ago that they would check you out anywhere, and that was, wow. Everybody's like, wow, the Apple store experience. Well, I think where it got really easy for us is Apple started selling Lightspeed. And so if you would ask any Apple store in the world, I want an Apple experience for my own retailer, they would say, well, go talk to Lightspeed. And so I think that's how we managed to get to the first 10 million, is we had all the Apple stores, all the Apple independent retailers and resellers that would just be selling and promoting Lightspeed. So with very little money, we managed to have a fairly large market. And then at $10 million, we said, okay, we're going to take on the world. We need money, and we got Excel, who put $30 million was the first round. But I think why is this important, and that's a philosophy for me, is the dilution at the early stage of your company is the most horrible, because that's where they take the biggest shares in the business. And dilution as you grow becomes, much better for the founder and entrepreneur. And so that's why this approach, I think, was very useful to us, not to dilute ourselves too much. And actually, it also forced us to build a fundamentally good company where we were making money, which a lot of entrepreneurs and startups tend to forget.
It's interesting because at Mars, we run a momentum program, which is companies going from 20 million to 100 million in revenue. And there was a time in that program that we had 22% of the companies, and there was about 60 companies in the program, had bootstrapped or revenue funded their way to 10 million in revenue. Mm-hmm. So it seems to be a skill that's in the water in Canada, which is kind of a really great thing.
That's what I was going to say. I think it is a very Canadian approach, because I think our approach at Dealmaker has not been dissimilar to the Lightspeed approach, where we got to break even very quickly as well. We took small amounts of financing, so we did early stage rounds, but we have always held ourselves really accountable to shareholder value and starting new business lines and getting them to break even very quickly, and that's the way you create the most value. And I wholeheartedly agree with the dilution point. That dilution in the early days really matters to the founders in keeping you motivated, 5 years down the road. So I think we all know the need to get the early stage checks in and getting excited about getting an investor in. But if there's one word of caution I would say is how happy I am today that we took those smaller rounds and really challenged ourselves. And it's hard as a founder. It's incredibly, you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself because you have less capital, but it also forces you to be strategic.
And at Dealmaker, you supplemented your growth with acquisitions as you got a bit bigger. Talk a little bit about that. Helped you kind of because that's also not a skill that in Canada is really a broad one. To most of it's organic growth, as opposed to really understanding how to strategically use acquisitions as a growth strategy for you. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you developed that and what impact that had on your business.
Yeah, I think, we haven't done as many as Lightspeed, but I think for us, doing an acquisition of a US company, we see more and more Canadian companies doing that, which I love, because for us it was very natural. Last year we acquired a partner of ours who was a digital marketing firm, and it allowed us to expand our product offering to what our customers were looking for. And the primary thing that I look at in an acquisition is fit. And so can you make 1 + 1 = 3 in terms of revenue generation, but also is the company going to be a good strategic fit with you? And for us, we knew, because we were already working so closely with those founders, that it was just natural for us to become one team. But we constantly look for more acquisitions. I think that should be part of a strong growth strategy.
You want to talk a little bit about
Lightspeed's
approach?
I think to scale companies, you have to do both. You have to be organic, and you have to go and acquire market, because I think the most important thing is momentum, and especially if you're in an industry that has high demand, you need to complement your own abilities with more momentum. And for Lightspeed, we did, I'm almost scared to say the number, we did 12 acquisitions in 10 years. We in the last 3 years, as a public company, we did, I think it's 7 or 8. And we did acquisitions of, equals. So we really scaled. But I think for us, we wanted to be sure, and I think it goes back to the question on, buying American companies or being bought in the industry in which we operate. So we do commerce platforms for retailers and restaurateurs. When you see an iPad and a scanner inside of a retail store or a restaurant, it's often Lightspeed. And so this market is up for grabs. There's hundreds of millions of investment going in every year. And so for us, we had to decide, do we want to be the one that scales and acquires and becomes the category leader, or are we going to be acquired? And I think our decision, when we reached 100 million in revenues, was, do we want to sell it and make good money and move on, or do we really want to be the global category leader? And we said, no, we're not going to let go of this business. We want to be the one that ingests everybody else. So we went on this, 9 acquisitions in 3-4 years. And we basically acquired every single competitor in the cloud space that was relevant, and it enabled us to have global scale. So now we sell everywhere in the world. We have offices all around the world, and we couldn't have done this organically. It would have taken too long, and we would have become irrelevant in most countries because somebody else would have done it. So I think you need to figure out at some point what is the size of the market, and if the market is big enough, I don't think a company alone can do it without acquisitions. I think you need to on top of your organic growth, acquisitions that are strategically going to give you more product and more footprint, simply.
There's an interesting data stat that last year in Canada was the first year that in the tech ecosystem that more companies bought other companies than Canadian companies sold. And so that was like a really big moment when we watch all these stats, obviously, and it was really interesting to see that stat. But the part of the stat that's not great is it was concentrated in a few number of companies that were buying multiple companies.
So that was all JP.
That was all JP, yeah. That's what I'm figuring out today. But the question I want to ask the two of you to just follow up on this is, when in your growth journey did you start considering acquisitions, right? Because when you start and it's organic growth in terms of what you're doing. When do you pull that trigger, and how did you know it was right to pull the trigger to go from organic growth to adding growth by acquisition to your strategy?
That's a good question. So for me, it started on day one. I was a capital markets attorney before, so I was very comfortable with M&A. So I always wanted to supplement our growth that way. But often in the early days when I looked at it, the dilution was more than my co-founder and I were comfortable with, and we weren't that ambitious about the company we were looking at. So for us, we don't have an M&A group, and so we're looking at it ourselves, and it just has to be the right strategic acquisition that makes the right sense and creates value for our customers.
Yeah, I think for us, it's when we got the funding from, funny but true story. So that was about 9 months after Excel put the money. And we had a board meeting, and they're like, we gave you the money for you to spend it, so stop keeping it on the bank account, because we were so geared to being profitable and to do that, we were a bit scared. So I think at that point, we had to make the decision. We started acquiring technology at the beginning. So at the beginning, we did tech acquisitions that would enhance the product. But very early on, as soon as basically we got the funding for a reason, because we said we want to grow, and when you talk about growth, you need to, I think, and I think maybe just making a comment on what you said on, I think historically, and that's what I think is great for Canadian tech, is historically I think tech entrepreneurs in Canada, everybody was waiting for the exit, and so the businesses were built where there was very little growth equity going into Canadian tech, actually, when in the early days of Lightspeed. And I think the dream of an entrepreneur was, I'm going to grow it to 30, 40 million, sell it for 200-300 million, and then spend the rest of my life, drinking margarita and being at the beach. And I think that's because there was no model. And I think even at Lightspeed, when we started and we said we're going to do an IPO, they're like, there's no Quebec company that's ever done an IPO. And so I think people didn't believe that they could scale the companies and be the ones. And I think ultimately, if you look at the history of Canada, it's always had great tech, but at some point it was always sold to a much bigger, and that was viewed as a great outcome. And I think now the mentalities are changing, where people are believing now, you have Lightspeed, Shopify, there's a few very large companies now, and people are now believing, okay, you can be the one, and we used to say we want this company to last forever, and I think that was our way of saying, well, we don't want to be acquired, we want to make this the category leader. And I think the times are changing now. There's more and more entrepreneurs who do not want the exit. They want to build a company that's going to last forever.
And hopefully they want to build it here in Canada, because that's what we really need, is more companies like Lightspeed and Shopify. Just to touch on a little bit of what you said, it was when you got the funding. So let's talk a little bit about the key financing or runway consideration. Talk a little bit about the financing kind of situations that companies need to be in when they start to consider this? And if you look at Dealmaker, like Dealmaker's in the habit of trying to fund companies, right? That's your, not the habit, that's your product that you're doing, right? In providing it. So maybe start with you and Rebecca, and talk a little bit about, what are some of the considerations that founders need to look at from their financial side and the financial health of their business when they're looking to considering for scale?
Yeah, I mean, there's the key considerations, right? You always want to have 24 months of runway, and I don't know how many of people actually do that, but a year is good. And when you start to monitor your cash position and you see how much runway you have, you got to start thinking about raising again. So I think that's the key job of a CEO in the very early days, making sure the company doesn't run out of money. I think it's over 80% of startups that fail because they run out of money. And while you're doing that is getting yourself to product market fit. And then beyond that, moving into growth phase, you then have to be realistic about the amount of capital that it's going to take for you to scale, because you have to start putting in bigger infrastructure, and everything always costs more money than you think it's going to, and takes a little bit longer than you think it's going to. So you have to hold yourself to really tight KPIs, and then plan for a worst case scenario.
Yeah, I'd say never put yourself in a situation where you desperately need the money, because that's where it's going to cost you the most. I think I always say it's the best thing when you're looking for money is that you're not looking for money. And if of course, when you're in the markets and you have 2 months left of runway, or a few weeks before your payroll, of course you're in a much worse situation. So I think planning is probably the best. And I think for me also is just ensure that you have the right funding for the right level of ambitions. And I'll give you a good example that was personal. So I was not the founder, but one in a company called Ixia when was it, 95, 96. And we went for $4 million of funding to go after Oracle. And I was like, and at the time I really believed we were going to build this new database for the web, but we were completely underfunded for the ambition. So I think that's the other thing, is look at the market size, think about your competitors, and ensure that your strategy is in line with your funding. Because, of course, that company had to pivot very rapidly. It's still alive and it's still doing well, actually, but it's just at the time we really had ambitions that were crazy, and with the money we had, there's no way we would have achieved the ambitions.
And so it's a good question, Canadian companies, because you talk about making sure you have enough funding for the ambitions. Where do you find it? Is it American? Is it foreign capital? Is it in Canada? Like, if you have the right strategy? I'm just curious as to what you, what your experience has been on how to find that right capital that gives you the. We've heard all the stories about Canadian startups, trade at a discount. We've seen all the numbers coming in. I don't believe that's true for either of your businesses. So I'd like to know, how did you find the investors that were willing to back your ambitions?
No, I think they found us. So Excel, we did nothing to get them, and they saw it as a conference, and they saw Apple all over us, and they're like, okay, we got to invest. So it was a very easy conversation.
You just had a good business.
We don't need money. They're like, with money we could do so much. I think for me, we took Excel, and in my mind, the quality of your investors is very important early on. And we took the money we had a lot of people who wanted to put the money. We took it from Excel because at the time I was like, oh, they're behind Facebook, and at the time, Angry Birds, and I was like, okay, these are real premium investors, and I'm like, I'm going to learn so much from these people, which ended up to being true, where next thing you know is they have sessions with CEOs, and they introduce you to everybody in their ecosystem. So I think this being said, there's a lot of good. I think that's also the big evolution in Canada, is at the time, there was no growth equity in Canada, very little, 10 or 11 years ago. Now you have, I think, good funding mechanisms for every step of the way, and I do think that funding in Canada is just as good as in the US. Last thing in my mind is diversification is probably important. Having Canadians and US investors in your company is probably a good thing. But I know for me, anyway, long story, but I think it's an interesting one, is we took Excel, and then 3 or 4 years after, Excel knew they would make a huge return, and they started to try and sell our company. So they started telling us, hey, go and meet all these guys in the Valley that were potential acquirers for Lightspeed. And I think that's, for me, when we turned to Canada, with the Canadian flight and said, look, if you don't put money in Lightspeed today to buy out Excel at this value, here's a term sheet, and we will no longer be Canadian. And that's where we found Caisse de Dépôt, it's CDPQ. But I think Canada showed us, and I think we kind of paved the path there also, because we were one of the first tech companies to be backed by a big Canadian fund, but they were there when we needed them.
So our timer's red.
Oh, yeah,
So
I
maybe,
speak too much.
Rebecca, I'll give you the last word on final advice to founders about what you think they need to, top of mind for them when they're thinking about scale.
Top of mind, make sure you're funded. 5 years from now, I want every entrepreneur to know that there's 3 sources of funding: VC, broker-dealer, or raising capital from your community digitally.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Hope
Thank
you
you very
learned
much.
a little bit about these great stories.
Thanks.